So it's a great pleasure to be here and to have the chance to talk to you and to engage with a topic that for years has been very close to my heart. And I'm particularly glad to have received this invitation from RTAO, because I think that having the possibility to talk to young activists or to the younger generation that is certainly facing a world that is posing not many alternatives, but that of trying to improve it and to make it better, is definitely one of the reasons why I'm doing the job that I'm doing, and one of the reasons why I keep engaging with these topics. So Didier already said that it's going to be an intense hour and a half. I'll do my best in order to have it also as participatory as possible. So please feel free to raise your hand digitally or visually if you have your camera on. I can stop, I can repeat, I can go faster or slower. Unfortunately, I don't know where you stand vis-a-vis an understanding of food systems and what are the challenges and opportunities of making the food system fair, equitable, and just. But definitely we are here for learning, and we're here in an attempt to strengthen also your basis. That we cannot talk about the present and the future without thinking about the past. And so we will have to take a couple of steps backwards and ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did we get to the food system that we are facing today and analyzing today, in order to better understand what are the problems that it is causing, both in terms of social implication, but also environmental impact, and then spending some time on possible interventions, whether there are false solutions and false interventions, or they are solutions that actually can get there where we want. So I'm Italian by origin, so I was born in Italy, but I've been around for a few years by now. And for the last 2 years, I've been at the Faculty of Law and the Institute of Development Policy of the University of Antwerp here in Belgium. At the moment, as Didier was saying, I'm mainly focusing on the interaction between law and the multiple social and environmental injustices that are reproduced within the food system. But that has been a sort of process and pattern that took me where I am, including that took me to the position that I have now as a research professor at the university. And definitely, when I think about my relationship with food and with the understanding of the connections between law and social and environmental injustices, there are three moments that I always think about. The first one is the first time that I attended a World Social Forum in Tunis back in 2013, I think it was, with the delegation of the Via Campesina there, because it was the first time that I had the possibility to spend several days surrounded by peasants and fisher folks who are actually making food possible. And that was a very important and game-changing and life-changing experience for me, of really understanding the amount of knowledge, the amount of wisdom, and the amount of engagement that was out there outside of universities, among those farmers, among those fisher folks, among those people that actually produce 80% of the food, but that we seldom see and hear when we think about food policies, when we think about high-level discussions about food and the future of food. So that relations has continued, and I was also with the Via Campesina in the COP21, I think it was, in Paris, 2015. And that was another moment where I had the possibility of really witnessing this separation between the people who were inside negotiating for the future of climate and those who were outside, and really the way in which discussions about the future of food and the importance of regenerative food system were brought forward, and they were put as priorities by the people outside of the negotiation rooms, but didn't really make it within the negotiation rooms. And that relationship between food and climate, I think, is something that I really invite everyone to focus on and to think about, and we can definitely expand a little bit more on that. And then another experience that for me was game changing was when I had the possibility of being doing a postdoc in the US, and that was the moment when I realized that even from within the university, I could be engaged in processes of social transformation, and in particular, in that case, it was the year of the first strong mobilization for Black Lives Matter, but it was also the years where the campaign for divestment from fossil fuel started. And so that was for me a kind of a moment where I realized that it was possible to continue with being within the university, but at the same time engaging with what was happening out there. And since then, I've been trying to do that more or less successfully, definitely with more failures than success. But right now, I think that I have a position that at least I'm trying to use as much as possible to really bridge this gap that normally exists between what happens within the university, that in most circumstances is a sort of an ivory tower that is very much detached from reality, and being as much as possible grounded on the real life of the food system, which, as I said before, is the real life of farmers, fisher folks, and people around the world that are producing, distributing, and consuming food, and for whom I think the support of academia is important. Something that Didier didn't mention, which I think is worth stressing in case people are interested in human rights and more high-level conversations. I'm also, for the last 6 years, I've been the legal advisor for the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food, which is a position that is open in the United Nations. Every 3 years, there is a vote and a person is appointed. So to be in charge of making sure that the right to food is protected, respected, and fulfilled around the world. And that definitely has been another opportunity to kind of get out of the university and get out there. So all of that to say, if you're interested in staying in academia, that doesn't mean that you have to become a boring person within a library. You can become, like me, a boring person, but also trying to be outside of a library. But there is also a lot of opportunities of engagement and interaction with social actors, both at the level of farmers and fisher folks, but also non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations. And I think that convergence of interest and that convergence of struggles is really what is needed now. It cannot be any longer that we have a fragmentation between the people who make food possible, and then civil society that is trying to support them, and then academia that is doing something else, and then policymakers that are completely in a separated space, making decisions that affect everyone else. And that's, I think, what I'm also going to be trying to talk about today. Because what I want to start with is just a couple of images so that you can kind of put yourself into a position that maybe you did not adopt before, and then you can start thinking about food in a way that maybe you didn't did in the past. You didn't do in the past. And the first thing that I want to share with you is, following on what has just been said, the importance of start thinking beyond the idea that food is just a commodity, beyond the idea that food is just something that we buy and we consume, beyond the idea that food is a product like any other item, any other object that we can find in the supermarket, or that populate our planet and populate the shelves of supermarkets and then populate the cities in which we operate. And so for me and for the work that we've been doing for several years, that change in perspective, the change away from the idea, well, a piece of bread and a car part are the same thing. Moving beyond that and really starting asking ourselves, what is it unique about food? And that uniqueness of food is something that you all are aware of. It's the uniqueness that allows all of us to survive, because without food, we're going to be dying. But it's also the uniqueness of the close ecological relationships that are represented in food. So food is a gift of nature. Food is there thanks to the possibility of nature to reproduce herself. It's the possibility of nature to thrive and seeds to become plants and so on and so forth, animal to grow, and etc. So that there is that element which is not visible in the other goods and the other objects that we lose when we think about food like any other commodity. And if we start thinking about food as a gift of nature, but also food as closely connected with culture, I'm sure that all of us, we have food that we associate with the place where we were born, food that we associate with specific moments in our life, food that we associate with family, with special moments, food that embeds us in a specific cultural context. If we think about food as part of well-being, food as a medicine. So we take a medicine by ingesting something and putting something in our body, but that's exactly what we do anytime that we eat or anytime that we drink something. So there is so much more about food that cannot be represented by the idea that food is any other object. And if we stop thinking about food as any other commodity, automatically and inevitably, we start asking for a food system that doesn't and that really recognizes the uniqueness and the multifaceted nature of food as something that goes beyond price, it goes beyond an exchange, it goes beyond a transaction between someone who is buying and is selling, and that it's really about all that complexity of values, but also all that complexity of people and natural resources that make food possible. So for me, what I think it would be a fantastic take-home message, and if it was what stays with you after this session, I would be extremely happy. This idea that we've been convinced for decades that dealing with food was just dealing like any other goods, and that's the way in which international trade has been constructed. That's the way in which food chains have been constructed. That's the way also in which charity around food is constructed, where they distribute food without asking questions about what the nutritional content of that food is, what is the history of that food, or what are going to be the implications once that food is received by a family that is in need. So what I would like you to do is from tomorrow on, hopefully, to stop thinking in the way in which you've been used to, and really start thinking about food as this complex network and interaction. And you see that automatically, I hope at least, that will change also the kind of requests and the kind of way in which you think about food, but also you think about the future of food. And the first thing that it changes is that you cannot think anymore about food as an isolated item. It's not anymore the thing that you buy in the supermarket and the action of consuming, but really becomes the entire system, that network of people, nature, that makes food possible. So anytime that you will be eating, you will be somehow participating in that network. So when you want to change something about eating and something about consumption, you have to ask yourself, how is that going to be changing that complex network of individuals, labor, investment, and etc. that make food possible? So the first step is, if we look at it from the perspective of a consumer, is to understand that we cannot change a tiny bit of a complex system without having ripple effects across all the system. And so we inevitably have to think in this way. But the same is if we want to change what happens on the farm. If we change the way in which agriculture is practiced, for example, which is something that the European Parliament has agreed today to do with the vote on the Common Agricultural Policy, we will inevitably change a lot of interaction and a lot of dynamics that are connected with the food system that originates on that farm. And we cannot think about one without thinking about the other one. And so when we think about the future that we want for food, we should stop thinking about just consumption, but we really should start telling ourselves we have to think about the future of the food systems that we want. And that's really the moment where inevitably it becomes political, because inevitably we start seeing that when we change one piece, there is going to be an effect that is creating some winners and some losers. And we have to ask ourselves, who do we want to be the winners and who do we want to be the losers? Are we okay with these actors in the complex food system that we are trying to change to lose because we want these other actors in the food system to win? Or we don't, and we are going to be doing everything that we can in order to make sure that the specific actors are winning, because these are the actors, or this is the ecological relationship that we really want to uphold. But in any case, whoever we identify as a winner, whenever anyone we identify as a loser, we'll have to be aware that there are going to be repercussions, and that this repercussion cannot be forgotten or dismissed. And that's when eating, or in any case, thinking about food system, is not only an agricultural act. So anytime that we eat, we're not only determining somehow the chain that makes that food possible, but it's a political act, because it's an act that determines where value is going to be allocated, who wins and who loses, who benefits, who's going to be in the market, who's accumulating, who's going to be missing out. And the same thing when we act as junior advocates, or when we try to establish a campaign, we have to know that whatever position we take vis-a-vis the food systems, there is going to be repercussion, and only by adopting a systemic understanding, no unintended consequences, and that really we are addressing those dynamics of imbalance and those dynamics of inequalities that you certainly are aware of. Okay, so that was already a lot for one slide. Now what we're going to be doing, hopefully, is going to be a little bit more relaxing, because it's just a story of how did we get here. So I just told you that if we think about food, we have to think about systems, interconnections, interdependencies, power dynamics, winners and losers. The other way in which we have to think about the food system today is that it's not inevitable and it's not natural. So some of the conversations that we had in the small groups and that were also reported in the plenary talked about food system that is disconnected, a food system that is not transparent, a food system where production and consumption happen very far from each other. And sometimes, because we were born, like I'm older than you, but I was born more or less in the same era in terms of food system where you were born, we somehow take that for granted. We take for granted that that's the food system. We take for granted that that's how food happens. We take for granted that this disconnection, detachment, separation, opacity is what the food system is about. Therefore, it's important that we take a step backward and we actually ask ourselves, how did we get here? And who have been the winners and the losers in the process of creating the food system that we're now looking at? Because I said before, only by looking at winners and losers and how we got here, we can think about the changes that we want for the future. And so in a very simplified way, there is a lot of authors and people who have been writing about that. But historically, if we look from a European perspective or from the perspective of the global north, so the European Union and the United States, there are three big moments, or three food regimes that are identified, and Phil McMichaels and Harriet Friedman are the leading authors on this. They started in the 80s. And they connect the food system with the creation of the global world. So what they do, which I think is something that may make food even more interesting for you, is to say, well, it's not that when we talk about globalization, we don't talk about food. It's not that when we talk about food, we don't talk about globalization. The two things happen at the same time. So what they do is they construct and reconstruct the history of globalization through the history of food. And they identify three main moments. So there is the colonial moment, so from the 1800s until the Second World War. Then there is the so-called industrial moment in the aftermath of the Second World War until the 1980s, until 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then there is the capitalist food regime. That is the one that we are somehow experiencing today, at least in Europe and in the United States. And I think that that's important for you to understand, because already by positioning globalization and the construction of the global food system as interconnected, you can see how much food was crucial in creating the dynamic of power and in creating those relationships that a lot of movements and a lot of people are criticizing today. So one extra reason to think about food politically is that food has been central in the construction of the globalization as we see it today. So very briefly, I'll go just through the three food regimes, and it'd be great also to get some interaction. So that's a map that would somehow exemplify the first food. So the first food regime, according to McMichaels and Friedman, is the food regime of the British Empire. And what they do is very simple. They look at the way in which the territorial expansion of the United Kingdom, of the empire, was closely connected with the production of food, and how the production of specific food was essential in order to guarantee a certain economic development in Great Britain, but also in the United States. And the best way to kind of summarize the close connection between the empire, food, and economic development, and so the creation of globalization and the creation of the world that we have today, is to show you these three pictures. You can probably read it on the map. There was a series of raw commodities. That's the way in which they would be called today. They were produced in North America, because let's not forget that North America had plantations and had slavery too. It was not only South America. So plantations in South and North America producing raw goods that were then transported to Great Britain and transformed into manufactured goods and then sold to Europe and sold back to the rest of the empire. So what this picture shows, I hope that you can bear with me and get it, is, so the two pictures on the right, is on the bottom right, you see slaves working in a plantation. And on the top right, you see factories. So I'm going to try to make it a little bit quicker. The British Empire was in the 1800s, and at the same time that the British Empire was actively contributing with the slave trade, they went through one of the most important economic moments for the history of the European Union, which is what is represented in the picture in the top right, which is the Industrial Revolution. So colonization definitely didn't start in the 1800s. We know that the entire 1500, 1600, 1700 were moments of occupation. We know that the North America, the United States, only got their independence at the end of the 1700s. Before then, they were a colony. We know that slavery was a thing in the United States even before independence. So there are centuries before that where we can already talk about colonies and already talk about the role of colonies in producing raw materials. The moment that is crucial is the 1800, because there was this combination of two things happening at the same time. So you had the colonies in the South, and in particular in North America, but also Brazil, producing raw materials going to the UK, being transformed into the factories, and then being traded elsewhere. What you may not know, which makes, I think, from the food perspective, everything more interesting, is that a crucial good that was produced in the colonies was sugar. And sugar was essential for the Industrial Revolution because sugar was the energy that was provided to the workers who were employed in the Industrial Revolution. So when the Industrial Revolution took place, what made it possible was access to cheap sugar that was produced in the colonies by slaves that had been abducted and traded and brought into the colonies. And that's when food and food system become crucial, because you realize that without having established a food system based on slavery and the appropriation of land through the colonies, Great Britain would have missed that cheap energy, that cheap fuel, that was essential to transform Great Britain in the center of the British Empire and the center of the world. So the head of an empire where the sun was never setting. And so already you see like the role in territorial expansion, food production, and economic inequality and economic disparity, because of course there was no interest for Great Britain to make sure that the sugar would stay locally where it was produced, because it was actually about importing sugar and other raw materials into Great Britain and then exporting added value goods that made Great Britain what it was, like a food system that had been leaving raw materials, sugar or other products territorially, and that had allowed the development of local food system or local industries would have never been capable of transforming Great Britain in the center of the empire. So that's the moment where, if you think again about winners and losers and the way in which food interacts with that, we cannot think about the Industrial Revolution, we cannot think about what we have today in Europe and what has been obtained in the last centuries in Europe and all this great pride that we have because we were the heart of the Industrial Revolution, in particular the UK, without thinking about slavery. So we cannot think about the factories without the plantations. We cannot think about whiteness without thinking about blackness. And we cannot think about freedom without thinking about slavery. And in all of that, food was central. So the construction of the empire and food are very close. So are we capable, the moment that we think about the food system today, to think about that. When we think about the presence today of large plantations that date back 2-3 centuries, are we capable of asking ourselves who has been winning and who's been losing in the moment that that food system has been established and maintained for 300 years? In the moment where food that is labeled and is considered to be of higher quality is still coming from some of these plantations, when the job dynamics and the work dynamics are certainly different from slavery, but not dissimilar in terms of who owns the means of production and who is actually just working on a daily basis, hoping to make it to the end of the month. Are we capable of taking that into consideration? Are we going back in history, or are we just taking that for granted and say, well, it doesn't really matter because the only thing that matters is the final product that is coming out from that context? And something similar again about history is something that we can say about the second regime, which is the so-called industrial regime. And here we can go way faster because it's something that we are more familiar with. And the way in which the industrial regime is defined is a regime that is characterized by a strong presence of the state, in particular of the United States and of some of the countries in the European Union, that are putting a lot of money and a lot of resources in strengthening their food system. And so for 50 years, in the aftermath of the Second World War, with the Marshall Plan and this reconstruction of Europe in particular, but also in the United States for the attempt to reconvert military industry into other forms of industry, we see that the state is actively putting money into food production, rewarding farmers on the basis of what they are producing, buying products from the farmers at high prices, because the states recognized the importance of the food system. And the priority was to strengthen the regional food system and make sure that farmers could stay on the land and make sure that farmers would be producing enough food for their people, which sounds something very reasonable, which sounds something that we would all like, right? So that our farmers don't have to fight on a daily basis in order to get to the market and sell the products and make an income and so on and so forth. It's something that we have been talking a lot when we think about the inequalities of the food system. Well, that was what a couple of countries were doing for 50 years. The problem is that not all the countries were doing it and not all the countries were capable of doing that. So at the same time that the United States and European countries were heavily subsidizing the agricultural system, they also started imposing restriction through the World Bank and through the International Monetary Fund on other countries who could not any longer subsidize their agricultural system. And so that's the moment where industrialization of agriculture for some countries becomes deindustrialization for other countries who could not really do the same thing that the global north was doing. And that creates an inequality and a disparity between the global north and the global south that is still visible today, and that is embedded in some of the most important policies that we see both in the United States and the European Union. So on the one hand, you have the Farm Bill in the United States, which is billions of dollars in subsidies that are provided to large-scale farming in the United States, which is creating a sort of situation by which the state, in the name of productivity, is providing resources to large-scale capital-intensive producers and not to the small-scale farmers that are practicing regenerative forms of agriculture and etc. So that was there after the 45, in the 50s, after the Second World War, has been continuing both in the United States and in the European Union. So we cannot think that we are different. And today, in the parliament, there was the vote for the new common agricultural policy. And the premises of the reason behind the common agricultural policy is exactly the same of subsidies to farming. It has been changing. There are elements of greening. We can say whatever we want. But the idea is that there is the public putting billions, and actually it's the most expensive EU policy that we have. It's around 40% of the EU budget, putting billions into farming in the name of making European agriculture stable, reliable, and keeping farmers on the land. But then if we can do it and other countries cannot do it, what we're creating is just a consolidation of a very uneven playing field where the North receives money from the states, the South doesn't. And so goods that are made artificially cheap by subsidies, by the common agricultural policy, can travel all over the world and compete with the goods that are produced locally. And so this picture, which historically applied to the competition between large scale and small scale in the United States or in the European Union, now applies globally, where you have large scale players that receive a lot of subsidies from governments in the North that are competing with smaller scale players outside the European Union, in particular in the global South, where this kind of subsidies is not possible. So once more, the situation that we have today is the product of historical dynamics that we cannot dismiss. We cannot think that that doesn't matter when we think, for example, about the common agricultural policy and why we want or we don't want the state to provide subsidies to agriculture. And then we have the final regime, according to McMichaels and Friedman, which is the one in which we are somehow living today, although, as you can already guess, like the system in which we're living is the continuation of all the systems and all the regimes that we've been living before. So we still have plantations, we still have subsidies, and etc. So to talk about the capitalist food regime doesn't mean that the food regimes before have disappeared. It just means talking about a system that has amplified certain characteristics. And for me, these are some of the key words and key concepts that also came about earlier on when we were talking, which is a system that has now a global outreach and that has intensified its outsourcing. It has intensified the going abroad in order to source for food, and has increased distance between the spaces of consumption and the spaces of production. But that is something that, of course, was there also during the colonial time and etc., but is increasingly accelerated in the last decades. It has intensified concentration of power because the longer is the chain, the harder it is to control it, because there are too many elements, and those who can control it concentrate power. And at the same time, it has increased competitiveness. So it has increased this idea that food is like any other commodity, and so companies and players have to compete against each other in order to gain market share. And competitiveness, in most cases, and then we will talk about that, means reducing the amount of money that stays with the people who actually produce food. Capitalist food regime, and we talked about that already, is based on the idea of cheapness. And based on the idea of cheapness, we can say a lot about that, but cheapness in the sense that food has to be kept as accessible as possible, because this is what keeps people going. And it's a continuous political battle between properly remunerating people who make food possible and then the risk of making food non-accessible. And at the moment, what the European Union and other political actors have embraced is this idea that we'd rather have cheap food than making food non-accessible. And so there is constant tension between cheapness and accessibility. And then there is also another element which you may be interested in, which is that of financialization, which means the fact that food has become increasingly a terrain for financial investors, where it's not about putting money because we want food to be produced, or we want money because we actually want to consume that food, but we put money into a market because we hope that the price of that commodity will increase in the future. So it's speculation on food, which I think is the best representation of how food now is considered like any other commodity and like any other object, because you can just put money today hoping that the price increases tomorrow, and you don't really have any interest in that food, but the interest that the price goes up or down, because that's allowing you to make money. And here and then we can take a brief break, and then finishing with the sort of possible way forwards. These are some a sort of exemplification of what I just mentioned and how that can be unpacked. So we talked about distance, and that came out in terms of transparency. But I think that distance is also very important in terms of responsibility. So the fact that we lose track with all the pieces of the chain and the fact that there are so many intermediaries means that it's increasingly easier to have human rights violation or environmental violation along the chain that makes food available, because there's always going to be the possibility to say, oh, but this is happening several layers, or several rings down the chain. It's not my direct responsibility. So when you talk about distancing, two things. First of all, it's not natural and inevitable. It has been constructed. So a long distance food system has been constructed throughout the century, but also it is willingly maintained because that allows to generate cheap food by making sure that there is violations or externalities and social and environmental problems that happen far away that no one has to take into account. And one point very important about distancing that we seldom think about is the relationship between long distance trading and climate change. Producing locally doesn't automatically mean that there are low greenhouse gases in the production, because if we do strawberries in Belgium in December, this is going to be very carbon intensive. But shipping goods all over the world accounts for around 7% of the global greenhouse gases. And a lot of that is food, and in particular, food that is used for as animal feedstock. So it's not only about transparency, it's not only about not knowing, but it's really about responsibility, and it's also about greenhouse gases and the impact that moving goods around have on the planet that we should be taking into consideration when we think about these distances that have been that are now taken for granted. Then the second point that I mentioned, just to give you a little bit more of context, is that of concentration, because the longer the chain becomes, as I was saying, the harder it is to organize and control it. And really, from a logistical perspective, a lot of investments and a lot of capital are needed in order to keep together places that are thousands of kilometers away and keep together 2.5 billion farmers with 7 billion consumers. And unfortunately, the fact that it requires a lot of logistics and a lot of investment means that only few players can put that money and can have that possibility of having that infrastructure and that control. And that creates a bottleneck at the center of the food system, which means that few players, in particular, very few traders. So we're talking about 4 large traders for most of the grains that are consumed in the world, for example, but very few processors and very few retailers are those who eventually shape the food system, both vis-a-vis farmers, because they have a lot of power to exercise when it comes to buying their crops and buying the product of the farmers, but also vis-a-vis the consumers, because at the end of the day, we can enter a supermarket and think that we have a lot of choice, but the choice has already been made by someone before us, which is the choice of what is produced, what is distributed, how is it distributed, and so on and so forth. So there may be a lot of choice, but it's not an unlimited choice that we as individuals are making. It's a choice that all those before us in the chain are making, unless we buy directly from a farmer. And in that case, there's just going to be 2 things that matter, which is the climate and what the farmers decided to produce. But otherwise, all that multiplication of goods that we see in supermarkets, or those thousands of items that we see in supermarkets, is the output of choices that have been made by someone else before us. And we will see later what that also means in terms of biodiversity. And then I think that that's the last point that I wanted to make on the contemporary food system, which is the level of financialization. And these are financial centers distributed all over the world where food is traded as any other share. And to give you an example, on a daily basis, the amount in terms of monetary amount of grain that is traded on the stock exchange on one day is higher than the total amount of grain that is produced during the year. So, and that's not because traders are interested actually in what is produced, but just because they are betting on the value that that specific commodity we'll have in the future, depending on how much is produced, how much is not produced, and etc. And this is creating a short circuit in the food system where a lot of dynamics are now defined not so much by production and consumption, but are defined by the intervention of financial speculators. And this is something that is seldom discussed, but really that we have to think about and to address when we think about the food system that we want in the future. Do we want a food system where my desire and my necessity to access bread, for example, also depends on how much money a private equity fund has been investing in the New York Stock Exchange on the specific wheat that is used to produce my bread, which at the end of the day is something that has already been happening in the past and has already been provoking social unrest like the Arab Spring in 2011, for example. So it's not something that is up in the air that never took place in the world. The main point and the take-home message for this part of the section, as part of the session, is that I want you to develop an understanding of problems through the lenses of winners and losers. Because too often we kind of look at the problems in terms of societal or environmental impacts within the food system, only looking at those who are losing out, those who are the losers, those who are marginalized, those who cannot afford, and etc. But we don't ask ourselves if there is anyone benefiting from that and if there is anyone that is actually thriving or who's actually better off thanks to the fact that someone is not having access to food and etc. And that's where inequity and inequality come at play, which is it's not only about the condition of people, so it's not just about good or bad, but it's also relational. So it's about comparing those who are winning and those who are losing and asking ourselves if that is a food system that we want. And that's the kind of approach that I try to have also when talking about the colonial time and the industrial time. Let's ask ourselves, when we think about something that doesn't work in the contemporary food system, who is winning and who is losing? Because we all know that if everyone was losing, probably the situation would have been changed already several years ago. So just going very quickly, issues around land grabbing and the expansion of plantations, so monoculture, palm oil, and etc., that are multiplying in several places around the world to produce anything from palm oil to cocoa to green beans that are served in our supermarkets. Issues around labor and labor conditions, so child labor, but also migrant workers, irregular migrant workers were paid few euro per day in Italy, or the exposure to hazardous pesticides and chemicals in a lot of value chains that we're looking at. Situations where more and more, well, at least in the last years, it has been reverting. More people do not have enough money to access food. So we've been talking about cheap food, and we've been talking about the fact that there is this obsession with food that is cheap. But we also see that there are more and more people who cannot afford it. So a food system that is, mistreating land and the environment, a food system that is mistreating workers, and a food system that is also unfair and unjust vis-a-vis consumers, because it's not really capable of providing, and that already creates some issues. How is it that on the one hand the food that we have is exploiting and therefore using cheap resources, but on the other hand is not even accessible for the people who have low income. A food system that is increasingly connected with malnutrition of any kind. So a food system that on the one hand is starving almost around 900 million people. So there is 1 every 7 people in the world who doesn't have access to enough food of quality and nutritional value. But there is even more people, more than 1 billion people, who are obese in the sense that they have access to food that is not nutritioning them properly, that is not giving them the adequate amount of nutrition, and that is creating a completely different form of repercussions and outcomes. So a food system that is not even capable of doing what a food system should be doing, which is like keeping people alive and making sure that they are healthy. And that's one of the most evident representation, a food system that is completely incoherent, where on the one hand you have a government that is saying, well, if you want to eat adequately, these are the standards that you should be following for your diet, like 5 a day and all the things that you probably know, and then millions of people who don't have resources to afford it. So it's a food system that apparently is impoverishing, is depleting, is marginalizing, is taking away dignity from people. But at the same time, it's also a food system that is pretty much rewarding someone. And that's a classic example of how the different players are rewarded when a chocolate bar is produced. And you can see who's winning and who's losing. You can see out of all those actors that participate in this very complex chain that connects, former colonies with industrialized countries where the chocolate is transformed. For example, Belgium, which is one of the globally renowned chocolate producers, not having grown one cocoa bean in its entire history. So you can see how that value is distributed. So you can see that at the same time that there is someone who is exploited at the beginning of the chain, there is someone who is definitely making a lot out of that. And the same thing happens even when you think about certified products. So those who are higher level and higher standards or higher quality, you see that this imbalance in the distribution of value, this imbalance in the distribution of resources is maintained. Even in the case of labels, you see that the largest percentage of what we pay is staying with the retailers. So it trickles a little bit more towards the farmers, but there is always a massive chunk of that money that stay with the retailers, that stay with those players that we saw before, concentrating the market. And it's also a food system where, on the one hand, you have an expansion in the value of those large-scale players, like retailers, that are somehow controlling the food system, but also a system that is, despite the poverty and despite the marginalization, is rewarding shareholders more and more. And this is just a statement that came out during the first wave of pandemic from the balance sheet of Nestle, which is one of the that is somehow controlling large part of the processed food in the world. And at the time where cocoa farmers in the global south were facing the pandemic and they were facing very low prices and they couldn't afford to send kids to school and etc., Nestle distributed billions of euro in dividends to their shareholders. So it's a food system that is taken away, but is clearly given to someone else. And I think that that's important when we think about the food system that we want in the future and what kind of dynamics we want to reproduce and what kind of dynamics we want to avoid. And that's, couldn't be expressed better than by this Oxfam report that came out during the second wave of the pandemic, which was all about the way in which certain players have been taking advantage of the condition of pandemic in order to expand their market share and expand their value without truly remunerating at all the people that were making the products possible. But the same thing, and again, I think that I need to brush up a little bit more, in terms of climate change, we know that climate change is one of the most evident and most direct threats to food systems today. But we also know that there are certain players that are thriving out of putting in place practices that are contributing to climate change. So 23% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture, in particular from livestock production. But then we go and check what the COP 26 did, and there was no reference at all vis-a-vis changes in the way in which agricultural production is taking place, and definitely no reference at all about the need to rethink and redefine livestock production and the contribution of livestock to greenhouse gases. So agriculture is suffering, but on the other hand, there are certain agricultural players, those who use massive quantities of nitrogen, those who are deforesting, those who are farming animals in an intensive way, or etc., that are taking advantage of practices that are creating climate change. So agriculture and the food system are at the same time losing and winning. And the point is, are we capable of making decisions, and are we capable of envisioning a future where that imbalance of power is also taken into consideration, or that imbalance of power is not going to be addressed? And the final point in terms of this kind of duality of the food system is something that I'm sure you're all interested in, which is the way in which we've been losing diversity, and in particular the diversity of food that is produced and the diversity of food that is consumed. And here is very graphically represented. But we could not understand that if we were not also thinking about the way in which the seed sector and the seed industry have been concentrated, and how the majority of the biological diversity that we have in the world that is distributed commercially, so that the one that the farmers are buying is owned by 4 big companies. So we cannot think about the loss of biodiversity without thinking about the appropriation of diversity by these players. And again, it's important that you keep that in mind, not because it's just the rant of someone who doesn't like what I see, but because there is no one without the other. And so when we think about the future of whatever chain that we can imagine, we have to ask ourselves if we are addressing that incoherence, if we are addressing the 2 sides of the coin, or we are just focusing on making one side a little bit better without really redressing that inequity that is underlying it. And the same thing, I forgot this one, but the same thing is about food waste, very briefly. So plenty of food waste and food losses in the world. But then if we really look at what that means, it means that there are industrialized countries that are wasting, so they're throwing away food that is already on the supermarkets or that is on the tables of consumer, while most of the countries in the global south, they are losing food, which means it's food that doesn't even make it to the tables because there is a lack of infrastructure. So can we say that it's the same? Can we say that the fight against food loss and food waste is the same between countries that have the infrastructure to make sure that that food is actually consumed or is not transformed into waste, and those countries that lack those infrastructure and that probably would do very well with those infrastructure because also they have a lot of people who don't have access to enough food. So we are not on the same boat, and we're not on the same boat locally, but also we're not on the same boat globally. And that is the product of, as I tried to explain earlier on, centuries that too often are forgotten when we think about the future of food. And that's why I think that there are 3 different ways of engaging and 3 different ways of thinking about the future of food. And really it's up to each of us and each of you in particular to think about what kind of vision you want to implement, and then advocate for that, knowing that you are going to be entering into a space that is historically defined and that has been creating winners and losers. And these are the kind of 3 macro areas that I see, that we've been writing about, and maybe kind of 3 ways of looking at a transformation that you can use for the workshop tomorrow. So there is a big chunk of trying to make the food system better, which I call business as usual. There is a less big chunk, but that is increasingly present at the European level, which we identify as the idea of a new level playing field. And then there is the kind of more transformative and radical, where issues like food sovereignty come into play. And I will give you some ideas of what these 3 blocks entail. So business as usual is somehow the idea that the market will naturally evolve into something that is better for people on the planet, because there is always going to be an incentive from within the market to address the new desires of consumers. This is something that came out clearly from the Food System Summit, which some of you may have heard of. But this is the idea that the efficiency of the market will find a solution to the social problems and will find the solutions to the environmental problems. And in this group, I think, belong issues like multi-stakeholderism. So the idea that you bring all the players of a food chain together, they talk, they discuss, and then they identify what the best solution for the chain is, but in a way that is voluntary, in a way that is horizontal, in the sense that everyone is considered the same, even if they're very unequal, and there is no active participation of the state that doesn't intervene by sanctioning or doesn't intervene with incentives. This is also what happens with code of conducts for human rights and for climate change, for example, where companies say we're going to improve our performance because we know that our consumers care, but also with voluntary labeling. So we're just putting a stamp on a package, because by doing that, we're responding to the desire of the consumers, and we are providing the consumers with what they want. But there is no request behind it. It is out of the classic idea that demand and offer will somehow match, and if there is more demand for greener goods or for better goods, the companies will adopt. A second block is the one that we're seeing now in the European Union, this idea of the new level playing field. And it involves the direct intervention of the public authority to sanction those behaviors that are considered to be inadequate or incompatible. And so we see things like the new climate policy and the new farm to fork that is putting standards and requirements in terms of the use of nitrogen, the use of the production of organic food, but also the common agricultural policy, which is a large amount of money that is given to farmers, which is now conditioned to social and environmental practices, mandatory labeling, which is something that the European Commission is proposing, of having by rule a label on each product that is providing consumers with information, but also things like the unfair trading practices directive, which is a great victory of the fair trade movement, which is about imposing sanctions when there is an abuse of the power imbalance that I discussed before. All of that is great, I think is a step forward, but sometimes is starting from the assumption that the future is to maintain the chains as we have, just making them better by sanctioning certain problems and by rewarding those who behave. So power is a problem when it is abused, but it's not a problem per se. Distance is a problem when you don't have transparency, but it's not a problem anymore when you have transparency. Plantations are a problem when there is the exploitation of workers, but are not a problem when the workers are sufficiently rewarded. Supermarkets are a problem when they are providing food that is unhealthy, but are not a problem per se. So it's not about challenging this food system that has been created in the last hundreds of years and intensified in the last 30 years. It's just to make it more compatible with the planetary boundaries and the social boundaries, which is a notion that I'm sure that you are aware of. And that's why there is a third way of looking at that, which is the so-called transformative or more systemic approach that is actually challenging the normality and the inevitability of the food system in which we're living, and is really based on the assumption that no one better than farmers, small-scale farmers in particular, agroecological farmers, and fisher folks know what is the adequate food system, and from the other assumption that food is not a commodity, but food is a right. So this transformative vision really uses and mobilizes two key concepts, which are that of food sovereignty, which is based on the idea that the decision around the food system should be staying with small-scale farmers because they are those who produce 80% of the food, but also because small-scale farmers are those who can put in place forms of farming and forms of interacting with nature that are regenerative and that are not only extractive. And then the idea of the right to food not only has the right to eat, but the right to have a food system that is respecting the planet, so that is sustainable in production, that is respecting the nutritional needs of people, and therefore is guaranteeing sustainable consumption, and that at the same time is recognizing that without fighting against poverty and inequality, there is no way that we can make the food system just, because we can then change the food system, but not providing people with the adequate means in order to access the food that is produced. We can change the food system and then have large parts of the society, large segments of the society for whom that food is still inaccessible. And therefore, we would not be recognizing the right and guaranteeing the right. And so what this transformative movement is asking for is for a strong intervention of the state, but an intervention of the state that addresses not only whether or not something is green, but really the power dynamics. So that takes that very unbalanced distribution of power and those very long and concentrated food chains and dismantle them and changes them and creates new dynamic that are also, and that's a crucial point, informed by the history and are informed by how we got here. So the food sovereignty movement would never accept that Europe becomes self-sufficient with food if that means that Europe is going to be starving someone else somewhere else, because there is also a historical responsibility of Europe to address and repair and restore the way in which it has contributed to create an unequal food system. And I think that only in this transformative move, you have notion of equality, equity, and fairness that are really embedded or really look at the relationship of power that characterize the food system. Of course, it's harder. Of course, like it's way easier to just put everything on the shoulders of consumers and say that we can change the food system, one purchase at a time. But the point of the transformative movement and the food sovereignty movement is that this is the only way that we can create a food system that is compatible with the needs of the planet and compatible with the needs of everyone. Because without addressing these dynamics of power, without addressing history, and without really accounting for the winners and the losers, we're inevitably going to be ending up in a food system or with a food system that is always going to be leaving someone behind. And that's not what a fair and equitable and just food system should be about.